Hello, my name is Michelle Miller, and I am the teacher for Biology 124, Global Ecology and Conservation Biology. And this is the introductory lecture. And I want to preface this with saying that I have new technology in front of me, and I'm learning how to use it. And my handwriting might be a little bit messy to begin with, but I'm hoping that it will get better over time. Okay, so this class deals with several disciplines, including environmental science. So that's environmental science. There we go. Okay. So when we look at environmental science, we look at how things in the environment interact with one another. And the thing that distinguishes environmental science from, say, ecology, which we're going to talk about as well, so we can talk about ecology, is that it doesn't necessarily have to do, environmental science doesn't necessarily have to do with living organisms. So when we look at environmental science and ecology, we can talk about that, how variables in the environment interact. So we'll say variables in the environment interact. So maybe we'll say how variables. Okay. So a good example of this that is presented to you in your book is an example of acid rain. And so when we look at acid rain is caused by industrial pollutants, and specifically things that emit nitrous oxide gas and sulfur, or nitric dioxide gas and sulfur dioxide gas. So like NO2, which is a waste product, and SO2, which is also a waste product. And these little dots down here are actually my hand touching the screen. So acid rain, these are pollutants. And in general, when a stack, from a factory, maybe it's a factory that's using fossil fuels to generate electricity, when these are released into the atmosphere, generally they'll disperse. But if there are too much of these produced, then they can interact with water, and it produces nitric acid and sulfuric acid. So nitric and sulfuric acid. Okay, so nitric and sulfuric acid form what is called acid rain. And the interesting thing about this is that the industrial pollution, it can be produced in one area, and then it can move in the atmosphere, and then you can get acid rain being deposited on land in another area. And so an environmental scientists, for example, might look at how pollutants are produced, how they interact with the atmosphere, and then also how those pollutants are dispersed. And then they might also look at how, for example, we could reduce the production of those pollutants, okay? So that's environmental science. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with living things. So this is a good example of a kind of an abiotic example, which we'll talk about in a minute. But ecology does. And so ecology specifically deals with how organisms interact with their environment. So this is how organisms interact with their environment. Okay, so part of the environment is said to be biotic, and this is the living part of the environment. Okay, so those would be the things that we have in our environment would be like plants and fungi and bacteria, and even viruses are somewhat living because they use living cells to reproduce. And so this is versus abiotic. So the abiotic components, whenever you see an A in front of a word, it means without life. And so the abiotic components mean that this would be things like rainfall, this would be temperature, this would be minerals, this would be like nitric dioxide and sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. So that was the abiotic component. And so ecology specifically deals with how living organisms either interact with their prey and their predator and their mates and all the other living things in their environment, maybe even their parasites, their microbiome, the microbes that live inside them, as well as how they interact with their abiotic components. So that would be like temperature, humidity, rainfall, and those kinds of things. Okay, so when we look at this, let me get my eraser out and erase some of these. The other discipline that we are going to look at this quarter is what is called conservation biology. And so conservation biology is a goal-oriented science. And the goal of conservation biology is to prevent the untimely extinction of organisms on the planet. So this is like medicine, it's goal-oriented. So that oftentimes means that it is applied. And the goal, being goal-oriented, the goal is to prevent the untimely extinction and the reason why we say untimely, and that says organisms, the reason why we say untimely is that we know that the vast majority of species that have lived on the planet have subsequently gone extinct or have given rise to new species. So like, for example, at one point in time, there were lots of reptiles, and reptiles were the dominant group of organisms on the planet. So you can think about dinosaurs, for example. And then they went extinct because of a mass extinction event that then subsequently led to the ecosystem becoming opened up so that mammals could then evolve and fill in those environmental niches. So we see that there's this rapid evolution of mammals. So today we have a problem in that when we talk about untimely extinction, most of the extinctions that are occurring are due to humans. And so it's not that the animals are evolving into new organisms or that they're going extinct because they're being replaced by other organisms. It's generally because the habitat in which they live is becoming degraded, or they're just losing habitat because the humans are using so much of the different habitats. So, for example, if you think about the rainforest, it's so diverse, we don't even know what organisms live in it. There's lots of species that are yet to have been discovered and named in the rainforest, but yet we're still cutting it down for agriculture, like, for example, palm oil. And that is leading to the untimely extinction of those organisms. And some of them, including the orangutan, are, the big species that we think of, we need to conserve. But we don't even know, when we cut down a rainforest, of all the little organisms, specifically the insects, for example, that are going extinct, that we don't even know. We haven't even given them a name yet, so they're actually unknown to science. And so that's conservation biology. It's goal-oriented. And then we really need to distinguish between environmentalism and environmental science. So environmentalism can be a philosophy, and it's not a science per se, but rather people try to use science to promote their ideas of what should happen, of what like an ideal society would be. And so they hopefully try to use science, right, to promote changes or change that leads to a more sustainable, and we'll talk about sustainability in a little bit, more sustainable population, or we'll put society. So we're talking about humans, society. Okay, so that's environmentalism. Okay, so it's really important to realize, and you'll notice this as you go through the book, you'll be like, well, I thought we were studying biology, but they're talking about economics. Or I thought we were talking about biology, but here they're talking about history or philosophy or any other kind of political science ideas. And so it's important to realize that this environmental science and conservation biology and even environmentalism, they have to be interdisciplinary. And what this means, so we can talk about interdisciplinary, what that means. Okay, so if you look at this, between disciplines. And so when we think about environmental science, for example, we need to know something about chemistry, right? We need to know something about physics. So if we're talking about energy and we're talking about finding alternative forms of energy, it's really important to understand the physics. And then also, this would be biology. Okay. So all of these we call hard sciences. But then we can also talk about the social sciences. So the social sciences would look at economics, for example. So what are the economic incentives that we can provide for people to use less natural resources? We could also look at history. So we can look at historically what people have done in the past. We can also talk about psychology. Right? How can we provide people with ways to make changes in their behavior that will help support the environment? Okay. And then we could also talk about political science, because obviously political science and the study of governments is important, because these are the people that make the regulations. And one of the really interesting things about this science, the environmental science, is it is a relatively young science. And so if we think back to the 1960s and the 1970s, that's when environmental science and ecology were first formed as a discipline that if you went to college, you could major in. And that is primarily due to governmental regulations. So the government provided regulations and required, for example, if you're going to build a subdivision, you need to do an environmental impact statement of how that subdivision is going to influence perhaps the flow of water in the watershed. Okay. And so that required that we train people to understand all of the different parts of this big question of, about designing sustainable places to live. So that was the beginning of environmental science. And now it is super important primarily because we have so many humans on the planet, over 7 billion people on the planet, and we all have to kind of share resources, right? And so it's really important that we understand the big picture of how we can equitably distribute resources in such a way that we don't have disasters occurring or famines occurring or people doing mass migrations because of climate change, because there's no food for them or not enough resources for them in their environment in which they lived, and so they have to move to a different area. And so all of these are going to become really super important in the future. So this is a really good, in general, really good, maybe not in this political climate, but it's a good area of study to go into. Okay, so that's the idea behind the different disciplines that we will look at in this course. And so we are going to now move to the scientific method. So I'm going to turn my page. Okay. Oops, turned too many pages. I have a brand new board in front of me, and it's kind of fickle. So this quarter, you are going to be designing experiments using the SymBio software. And you're going to be manipulating variables, and you're going to be asking questions, and you're going to be having to write lab reports. And so it's really important that you get a grasp of the scientific method early on so that you can do really well in the lab portion of this class. So when we talk about the scientific method, oh dear, starboard. When we talk about the scientific method, we can talk about observations, for example. That generally is the beginning. Okay, so you can make observations about the environment. You can notice that the acidity in lakes and streams and ponds increased, and then you can ask a question. Okay. So in science, the question is really important because it has to be a question that can be answered by science. And it's really important for you to realize that not all questions can be answered by science. And so when we talk about ethics and morals and what we value, those are questions that cannot be answered scientifically. And so we could ask a question like, where are the pollutants coming from, you know, in the atmosphere that are causing the acid rain to fall in this particular area? So that's my question, okay? And then your hypothesis is really important, and it is very different from a theory. So your hypothesis is not a theory. In science, theories are like big deal, and specifically in biology, they're almost like laws, and they're well supported by multiple lines of evidence, and many people have concluded that the evidence suggests that such and such is correct. Okay, so a hypothesis is different. A hypothesis is an educated guess. And so sometimes in our normal life, we use theory instead of hypothesize. So for example, I have this hypothesis that if I stop eating by 6 o'clock in the evening, I will sleep better. Okay, but then I would say, I have this theory. I have this theory. You need to stop eating by 6 o'clock in the evening and you'll sleep so much better, right? I would say that's a theory, but that is actually a hypothesis because it has not been well documented. And how could I even, you know, how do we define, you know, there might be some variables there. We would have to define what it means to sleep better, okay? So oftentimes we use theory and we use it differently than the way that scientists use that word, okay? So then we have the hypothesis, and then we have an experiment that is used to answer. The experiment must be designed, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the experiment is designed to answer the question. And then we have conclusions. And you have to have your conclusions, and your conclusions tell me whether or not your experiment supported your educated guess as to what the answer to the question was. And oftentimes, and even in your SymBio experiments, sometimes they'll ask you to design your own experiment based upon what you found. So then we go back to, oh, what are my observations? We might, you know, hop from experiment up to question, hypothesis might come up, a new hypothesis might come up in your conclusions. So this is not really a linear thing, but rather it's just a set of things that happen when we study things from a scientific perspective. Okay, so when you design an experiment, we have variables. And the variables include the independent variable. And so these are things that the independent variable are things that you change. So these are things that change. So change, right? You can alter these. So these are variables that you'll be able to alter, like you might be able to alter the density of wolves on an island, for example. So that would be your independent variable. And then your dependent variable would be what you would measure. And so you might measure the health of those wolves. So my hypothesis might be that if you have too many wolves in the environment, then they're going to become weaker, right? Because there's not enough food for them, and some of them might die off. So that would be the dependent variable. And then you would also have a control variable. So you'd want to keep everything else. So this is what we keep constant. So the dependent variable is what you measure. The control variable is what you keep constant. So there's a video associated with week 1 that you need to read or you need to watch, and it's on bumblebees and fungicides. And so you want to be able to tell me what the hypothesis was, what's the question, and then what are the variables and how did they test them? This will be something that you will do on a regular basis. You'll be looking at variables and how you alter them and how they are affected. Okay, so continuing on with chapter 1. Chapter 1 deals with the 4 principles of sustainability. And within these 4 principles of sustainability are some key ideas that I'm going to introduce as I introduce the principles of sustainability. And so when we look at sustainability, this means that you use natural resources in such a way that you are not overusing them and compromising the ability of future generations to have a healthy lifestyle, okay? So sustainability, we'll just say sustainable. This is using natural resources in such a way, such a way that it does not compromise the needs of future generations. Okay, that's really hard to do because our economic policies and our political policies are very short term. So it's like, how are we going to make the planet better than when we left it for future generations, right? And so what kind of incentives do we have to do that? We have very little incentives for that, right? But really, we don't want to have a future for our children or our grandchildren, or what they say, the 7th generation. So there's you might see the 7th generation products in the grocery store. That refers to the idea that we should live in such a way that the people in 7 generations from now will be able to survive and to live a healthy lifestyle on the planet. Okay, so that's what the idea of sustainable is. Okay, so principles of sustainability. The first one is that we will use natural resources and environmental services in a sustainable way, right? So number one is use. So this is the first one, natural resources. And so a natural resource is something that we get from the planet. It could be water, it could be minerals, it could also be even our atmosphere, right? So the oxygen that we breathe in is a resource that we have to have in order to survive. So we use natural resources and environmental services. In a sustainable way. Okay, so if we look at these environmental services, these are natural processes that help to regulate our environment. And so when we look at the carbon cycle, for example, okay, so this would be regulation, example of this is regulation of the carbon cycle. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to produce enough carbon that that carbon can then be taken out of the atmosphere. So like if we're breathing out carbon, we'll talk more about this when we talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, but I breathe out carbon dioxide and then the plants take it up. But if I breathe out too much carbon dioxide, then so that the plants cannot take it back up and it cannot recycle, then that is not a sustainable service, right? Another good example of this is fresh water, right? So when we look at the production of clean water, so some people rely upon waters that are in an aquifer. And this is groundwater that could be very, very ancient, that is stored in these huge underground reservoirs. And the biggest one being the Ogala aquifer in the middle of our country. And the way that we're using it unsustainably is that we are pumping it for agricultural use faster than new water is coming in. And so we're depleting these big, giant reservoirs of clean, fresh water under us by using too much in an unsustainable fashion for agriculture, okay? So that would be an example of an environmental service. And another one might be, if we look at living organisms, we could talk about pollinators. So pollination of plants. Why do we even need bees? Like you could say, I don't like honey. Why do I even care about the European honeybee? But if we think about it, they provide a huge environmental service by providing pollination, which means that they transfer pollen from one plant to the other, and the pollen is essentially the sperm. And so the sperm get transferred to another plant and it fertilizes the egg, and then we get the fruit, right? And the fruit being the little plant embryos, right? And so pollination of plants would be another good example of an environmental service. Okay, so one of the things that happens with our practices, let me erase these extra, is that humans typically follow what is called the best first principle. Now, this is not a principle of sustainability. So I'm going to put it in quotes, the best first principle. And what this means is that they use the best resources first. So the highest quality. And also humans, when they go out, they want it easy, right? So if you were going to go fishing, where would you fish? You would fish where there's lots of fish, right? So you would go to the best streams, You might go to the best areas off the coastline where you know that there are fish, and then you would catch the easy fish, right? So you wouldn't catch small fish, you would probably catch big fish, right? And so this is the idea that we use the highest quality of resource first. So humans use the highest quality of resources first. Okay, this is not sustainable because what happens is that we over harvest. Because it's so easy and it's of high quality, we can then therefore easily deplete resources. So it causes the depletion of the resource. And then we have to go looking for easier, we have to go looking for new resources to exploit, right? And so a good example of this might be oil. So if you think about oil, when they first started putting oil fields in Texas, for example, they would pump down and then the oil would just gush out. And it was like, wow, this is just such an easy resource to extract. Well, now that we're running out of oil, now they are looking at new places to get oil. And one of these is what is referred to as the tar sands. And this is the big issue with the Keystone Pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline is that they're using the sand that is permeated with petroleum products. And it's really hard to extract. It's like dirt with oil in it. It's really hard to extract the oil from it. So that's going to take energy. And then the oil is not very clean. And so it's sometimes said to be dirty oil. And so now that we've used the easy, now we're going up and using tar sands. We're hydraulic fracturing rocks. We're going in and pumping water into the earth to extract natural gas, for example. Or we're going off the coast and putting in big oil rigs to extract oil in the water. And that's really hard. I mean, if you think about it, maintaining those oil rigs out in the ocean. And specifically, if something were to happen, then it would be very hard to clean up, okay? So this best first principle is not a principle of sustainability. It's this idea that best is first. So the best quality of resources is first, that which is first taken, okay? So that's an important distinction to make. Okay. Let's go on to the next page. Okay. So when we look at resources and how they are being replenished, we could look at some resources, and this is from your textbook. So we could look at biodiversity. So it takes about 20,000 years to create 20 mammalian species. But within the 21st century, so within 100 years, we have killed off 20 species. And so that means that we use it 200 times more than the rate of replenishment. Okay, and the same thing with oil. Oil is really interesting. We'll talk more about that, but oil is actually fossilized plants. And so it had to occur over a very long period of time where plants were creating biomass, and then they became buried, and then that carbon that was stored in the plants then was converted to oil. And so it takes a long time, right? 8.8 million barrels per year created by geological processes. And we use 34 billion barrels per year in our economy. The same thing with tropical rainforests and fertile soil, okay? So that means that we are using those resources unsustainably because they are being used faster than they are being replenished, okay? And then if you look at the harvesting of fish, we see that we have increased the millions of tons of fish that we harvest, wild catch. And then we've also increased farming, right? And so the prediction here is that we are over harvesting. And so many of these places that used to have really abundant fisheries are now fishermen are finding that they actually close whole areas because the fishermen can't find enough fish, right? So that's just the idea of over harvesting, and the best principle of resource use. Okay, so let's look at the second principle. So the second principle is this idea that we have to understand that humans are part of the system, that we interact with our environment, and we can greatly influence our environment. And so we can say that, that the second principle states that humans are part of a larger system that encompasses the whole planet. Okay. So humans are part of a larger system that encompasses the whole planet. Okay, so we are not separate from nature, we are part of nature. It's another way to kind of say that. And it's important to realize that when we look at a system is interconnected parts. So a system consists of interconnected parts. And interconnected means that if you adjust one part of the system, is going to affect all the other variables. So if you change one variable, it's going to affect all the variables. And so when we look at systems, and when you think about your human biology, and you think about, digestive system, so we can think about the atmosphere as a system. We could also think about the rainforest as a system. Okay, so sometimes people say that the rainforest, for example, are the lungs of the planet, because they breathe in carbon dioxide and they exhale oxygen, just exactly the opposite. And you can actually see that the difference during the day versus the night in the atmosphere. Okay, so when we think about systems, we have variables. And so these variables interact, and so we can have interactions that include, so we'll look at mechanisms of change. We have what is called the positive feedback mechanism. Okay, so this is positive feedback mechanism. So positive does not mean good. So it's kind of like that best first principle. Okay, positive actually is kind of a bad thing because it leads to a disruption of the system's set point. Okay, so this leads to a disruption in the system. Specifically, maybe we'll talk about the set point. Okay, so the set point could be temperature, right? Annual average temperature. It could be the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It could be, the set point might be the salinity of a pond or stream. Okay, those are things that we've just talked about. And we'll talk about more. But the positive feedback system means that a change in a variable, so let's say we have an increase in temperature. Okay. So this increase in temperature then leads to let me see my example. Okay. This increase in temperature leads to permafrost melting. And you may have seen in the news these huge, weird-looking holes that are really symmetric, that are forming these giant holes, and that's when the permafrost melts, and then gases are released. So the permafrost melting, right? And this increases the release of methane. So methane is a gas that is stored underground. It's CH4, right? And it is a greenhouse gas, just like carbon dioxide. And so what happens then is that we have an increase in methane. Paste these marks. And then this increases greenhouse, increases the greenhouse effect. And we're going to talk more about this in detail in upcoming chapters, right? And then this leads to an increase in temperature. So the idea here is that temperature is a set point, right, on our planet. And we want to keep it relatively a constant in order for ecosystems to function appropriately, right? So by causing the permafrost to melt and the releasing of more greenhouse gases, we're accelerating the increase in temperature, okay? So that's a positive feedback mechanism. So it is not necessarily, it's a bad thing in this particular instance, okay? In our bodies, we have lots of negative feedback mechanisms. So for example, we have the ability to regulate our body temperature through negative feedback. So let's look at one scenario in environmental science that might be an example of a negative feedback mechanism. So if we increase CO2, so let's say there's an increase in atmospheric CO2, okay, this increases photosynthesis by the plants, and this leads to an increase in plant growth. So, you say, that's a good thing because plants are being more productive, and then maybe we can use them for wood or eat them, for example, okay? And then this would decrease CO2. So then we have a decrease in CO2 because the plants are taking the CO2 out. So this response decreased the stimulus, and it leads to a relative constant atmospheric CO2, okay? Now we're producing too much CO2, and this is the argument for why we should not be cutting down rainforests, is that they can actually serve as a carbon sink, which means that carbon can be stored in the biomass of the plants and actually can help regulate the environment. And so ecologists were hopeful that the plant had some negative feedback mechanisms that would help to maintain what is referred to as homeostasis, which is a kind of a relatively constant state. And so, but we're seeing that the changes are so dramatic that there's lots of changes in the planet that are upsetting the set points that were established, okay? And it's upsetting it at such a fast rate that the ecosystems and the animals that live in those ecosystems are unable to evolve or change fast enough in order to be able to survive, okay? So that's the idea of the negative feedback. So in your book, you are going to read about Easter Island. So Easter Island.
I can learn to understand you much better if I can get familiar with the way you talk.
Okay. Oh, I don't want you. Okay. This is interesting. Okay. I showed up in my classroom and nobody told me this new technology was here. So Easter Island, oh man. Okay, I'm gonna have to write it someplace else. Easter Island, okay, so write this in your notes, Easter Island, and you're gonna read about it as a system. And so the Easter Island is famous for the moa, and the moa are these giant basalt statues of people, And it was believed that people created these kind of as a form of competition. So if you imagine if you're living on a small island, you develop a culture, and then you're kind of competing with each other to build larger and larger statues. And so they see that the statues actually increase over time. But what they also find when they study it archaeologically is that the island, Easter Island, used to have forests on it, and then the forests were depleted. And so you want to see how, for example, they used, there's a little video in your textbook that shows how they may have used the wood to roll those giant statues or to move them to the place where they are now located. And then there's also a discussion of introducing a new variable into the system, which was the rat. And so the rat that was introduced feeds upon the nuts of the tree and is believed to be perhaps a major contributor to the decline of the Polynesians. Also, when the Dutch arrived on this island, they also did bring disease. So the few remaining people on the island after there was a kind of a collapse, then subsequently died probably from infectious disease that was brought over by colonists. And that's kind of a common theme for indigenous people to be really susceptible to infectious diseases. Okay, so that is the second principle. And so I'm gonna turn the page, hopefully this will work. Okay, so this is Easter Island. I turned too many. Easter Island is off the coast of Chile. And it's very far off the coast of Chile, right? And it's a very small island. And so it's a very enclosed system. And it just talks about how the variables were disrupted, and we see kind of a fall of the civilization that was once so complex that they were able to spend their time and energies on building the moa. So the people that live there, the native Polynesians, are the Rapa Nui, and then these are the moa. Okay, so let's look at the third principle. And the third principle has to do with humans and the idea that we need to be equitable in our use of resources so that everybody has the same opportunities. And so the third principle is that we need equal opportunities for human development. And we think about human development when we think about what it is that humans, kind of the basic rights of humans. And these would include things like education. It would also include access to healthcare and a clean environment, access to employment, and also political freedom. And so when we look at equity, even within the United States, we see that there are disproportionate, very disproportionate in some cases, equity, so it's unequitable. And so the biggest example that you might have seen recently is Flint, Michigan, and how their water is so tainted with lead that is undrinkable. And so they do not have access to clean water. They have to buy water in order to bathe and to drink and to cook. And so human development would be giving people opportunities for education, healthcare, a clean environment, income, employment, and political freedom. Okay, so I'm going to say education, healthcare, which is a big one. A clean environment. So oftentimes people that are poor live in more unhealthy environments than people that are not poor. Okay, so your clean environment kind of goes along with income. And then we can say that would include water, for example, and employment, so that they should be able to earn a basic income and that they have political freedom. Okay, so they're able to speak what is true to them in a political fashion, so that they are not thrown in jail, for example, for speaking out against a particular official. So when we look at how we measure this, one way is to look at the per capita gross domestic product. And so this is where economics comes in. So per capita means per individual. And domestic products are all the services and resources that are produced by a particular population, like the goods and resources that are produced. And so when we look at the US per capita, it is about $25,000 to $50,000 per individual. Okay, or you know, that's per individual, yes. Okay, so averaged over individuals. And then, so this would be the US, but in India, it is $100 to $1,000. So this is the US, and then this is India. Okay. So the reason why this is so important is that we're going to talk about economics, but it's related to affluence. And so as we increase our gross domestic product per capita, we oftentimes use much more resources. And so when we think about people in India, we say, well, they're having too many children and their population is too big, and that's what's straining the natural resources of the planet. But in reality, it's because more of an issue is because of the developed world, and that we use a disproportionate amount of resources. And so we are producing much, much more, for example, greenhouse gases than an individual in India would, than India would, just because of my lifestyle. And some of that lifestyle is pretty, it's almost governed by the culture where you are. So for example, when I was building a house, there were like limits, like you had to produce, you could not have a house that was under 1,000 square feet. Like they wouldn't let you build a smaller house under 1,000 square feet. Like that was code. And so it's kind of a weird system that kind of keeps us in this system of utilizing natural resources. We don't have public transportation where I live. So we're kind of have to use our own car, or we could bicycle, but it's kind of dangerous on the roads, right? And so there's kind of these things that are set up that make it more difficult to be sustainable. Okay, so if we look at some diagrams here, oops, we're almost through with this lecture, almost to the fourth principle. Okay, so this just looks at some other things. So let's look at education. So Canada, pretty high literacy rate, but so does Kenya. That's kind of interesting, right? Population with access to clean water, 100% in Canada, 57% in Kenya. Okay. Nutrition, HIV prevalence, life expectancy at birth, and then the mortality rate. And so all of these are kind of measurements of human development, right? And we'll talk about the different stages of populations as they go through different stages of development. And then if you look at the differences in the use of resources, so human water use and meat consumption is much higher in the US than in India, right? Grain consumption, sulfur dioxide emissions, which relate to acid rain, greenhouse emissions, tons of CO2, right? This is per individual. So I produce 19.1 tons of carbon dioxide as opposed to 1.18 tons that they use in India. And so this is the problem is that there is unequal use of natural resources. And that goes back to principle number 2. Okay, so let's look at the fourth principle. And the fourth principle to sustainable society is that we must have incentives for sustainable behavior. Okay, so we must provide incentives for sustainable behavior. So we need to give people some kind of reward for doing the right thing. Otherwise, that's kind of it's like a psychological, social science kind of thing, right? And so one way that this works is that you might get a rebate. You might get money back. You might get a tax credit. So let's look at maybe a tax credit. So example here would be a tax credit. Oops. For efficient appliances. So when you go out and buy a dishwasher, for example, right? Sometimes they'll say, well, this one, if you spend a little bit more money, it costs more, right? But it uses less water. And so because it uses less water and less energy, we will give you a reward for buying the more sustainable dishwasher. And so we'll give you a rebate, or the government, you can write it off on your taxes. So there's a little, you can get tax breaks when you itemize for buying efficient appliances. You can get tax breaks maybe for doing solar. You can get tax breaks for replacing your windows, your single pane windows with energy efficient windows, okay? And so we must find a way that we provide incentives. So like right now, I have very little incentive in Pendleton, Oregon to recycle, right? So I am actually do recycle, but it's like a big hassle, right? So you have to sort everything and then you have to put it in your car and you have to drive it to the station, right? But in some places like my friends in Seattle, when I go to visit them, if they do not recycle, if they find recyclables in their regular garbage, then they actually get a fine. And so that's an incentive too, is you could say, well, you recycle or you are fined for this. And so they even recycle compost. So they have a person that comes and bricks up the compost, and it can even contain milk and cheese and meat products in it. And so it's very efficient, and it's an incentive to get people to change their behavior, okay? So that's the fourth benefit, okay? And then we have a kind of something that goes along with this, which is the idea of subsidies. Okay, so subsidies is a benefit given by the government to individuals in the form of a cash payment or tax reduction. So this is benefits given to individuals or companies, groups, we'll put in response to a particular behavior. Now, sometimes we subsidize farmers, for example, to grow particular crops. We might give them a subsidy, okay? Now, kind of the opposite of this, but it's related to how the government treats natural resources, is what is referred to as externalities. Let's go down here. So we have what are called externalities. So that first one, the subsidy, the tax credit for appliance, they're actually giving me a subsidy for buying a cost-efficient appliance. Okay, so externalities are costs that are not borne by the group or individual doing the behavior. Okay, so we can talk, a good example of externality would be, say, for example, forestry. So if we use the example of logging, okay, we could look at one of the externalities. I mean, a company might pay for the wood and might pay for the people to go in and cut the wood, right? And may pay for the extraction of the wood. But an externality is a cost. And so an example of this would be erosion. So this is just an example. And so say, for example, they log a hillside, and then the hillside, the trees were holding the soil on the hillside. So it rains a lot, and you get a great big landslide, and maybe the landslide ends up into a stream, right? And then you get soil in the stream. So we get erosion, and we get maybe silt in the stream. And this could be a cost because it damages the ecosystem. So maybe it damages the fisheries, right? And so oftentimes, you know, this is not a cost that is borne by a logging company to go in and log, right? They don't. Another cost would be, for example, they are actually decreasing the ability of the planet to absorb CO2 because they're removing the forest. So if you think about logging in the tropical rainforest, they're just slash and burn. They cut it down and they set it on fire, and then they plant their crops. Well, what they're doing, a cost would be that they're eliminating that forest that was actually absorbing CO2. And so that's an externality to logging in tropical rainforests, is that the cost would be an increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Okay, so that is it for today. This week. This is week 1 of global ecology.